You've probably heard it called the Soviet Union's Vietnam. We're talking about the Soviet-Afghan War. In December 1979, the USSR rolled its tanks into Afghanistan, kicking off a brutal, decade-long conflict that, honestly, would change everything. Not just for them, but for the entire world. So how on earth did it all go so wrong for them? Let's get into it.
So here's the big question, right? How did a global superpower, with this massive army designed to fight a war in Europe, get completely bogged down for 9 years in a war it just couldn't win? It was a huge strategic failure. To really get it, we need to rewind a bit and look at the absolute chaos that pulled them in the first place.
And that title says it all, really. This whole story didn't actually start with Soviet tanks crossing the border. Nope. It started with what was basically a frantic call for help from an allied government that was falling apart at the seams.
Okay, so just look at how fast this all went down. It is wild. In April '78, you have this Marxist party, the PDPA, that takes power in a coup. Almost immediately, by December, they sign a treaty of friendship with Moscow. They're all in. But here's the problem. They push these radical, secular reforms that just do not fly with the deeply religious and traditional Afghan countryside. By March '79, boom! You've got a huge, violent uprising. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the party starts eating itself alive. In September, the president is assassinated by his own number two. So by the end of 1979, the country is in flames, and Moscow is panicking, thinking its brand new socialist ally is about to go under.
So how did the Kremlin justify sending in the tanks? Well, they had this thing called the Brezhnev Doctrine. It was a pretty simple idea, really. It basically said, if you're a socialist country and your socialism is under threat, we, the Soviet Union, have the right to intervene to fix it. They'd already done this back in '68 in Czechoslovakia. So for them, applying the same playbook to Afghanistan seemed, well, logical.
But here's what's so fascinating. Not everyone in Moscow was on board. In fact, some of them saw exactly how this was going to play out. The Soviet premier himself, Alexei Kosygin, gave this warning to the Afghan leaders, and it is just chillingly prophetic. He basically said, look, if we send our troops in, things won't get better, they'll get worse. Our soldiers will end up fighting your own people. He totally nailed it. But nobody listened.
And because that warning went unheeded, the war began. A war that, right from the very start, was just a total mismatch.
Now, the Soviets did not mess around. They went in big. At their peak, they had about 115,000 troops on the ground. We're talking tanks, Hind helicopter gunships, heavy artillery, the whole shebang, the full force of a modern superpower.
But look at the numbers on the other side. They are facing an estimated 250,000 Mujahideen fighters. That is more than double their own forces. And these guys weren't just numerous. They were fighting on their home turf, in mountains they knew like the back of their hand, and they were incredibly motivated.
And this right here is the absolute core of the problem. You had the Soviet army, this centralized, top-down machine built for one thing, a massive tank battle on the flat plains of Europe. And what were they up against? The complete opposite. The Mujahideen were decentralized, small, mobile groups. They used classic guerrilla tactics, hit and run, sabotage, ambushes. They'd strike and then just disappear into the mountains. It's like trying to fight smoke with a hammer. The Soviets were totally unprepared for this kind of war.
So what happens? You get this brutal, bloody stalemate. Yeah, the Soviets could control the big cities. They could control the main highways during the day. But the countryside, which is almost 80% of the entire nation, that belonged to the Mujahideen. It was the definition of a quagmire. They were stuck.
Okay, but this wasn't just some regional fight. This was about to go global. This war became one of the hottest battlefields of the entire Cold War.
You see, the Mujahideen had friends. Lots of them, and powerful ones too. The United States, through a program called Operation Cyclone, saw a golden opportunity to give the Soviets their very own Vietnam. A painful, costly defeat. You had Pakistan's ISI, who were crucial for logistics, funneling weapons and fighters across the border. And then you had Saudi Arabia, China, the UK, all pouring in money and arms. Everyone had their own reasons, but the goal was the same: bleed the Soviets dry.
And in 1986, all that foreign help delivered something new, a weapon that would become legendary, a true game changer.
I'm talking about the Stinger missile. This thing was a nightmare for the Soviets. It's a shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missile, which meant a single fighter hiding on a mountainside could take down a multi-million-dollar Soviet helicopter gunship. It completely neutralized the Soviets' biggest advantage, their control of the air. Suddenly, their deadliest weapon, the Hind helicopter, became a vulnerable target. This made the war exponentially more expensive and deadly for Moscow.
So, let's recap. By the mid-80s, the Soviets are stuck in a stalemate on the ground. Their helicopters are getting shot out of the sky, and the costs in both lives and money are just piling up. The writing was on the wall in Moscow. This war was a losing battle.
And then there's a huge shift back in the USSR. A new guy's in charge, Mikhail Gorbachev. He's got these new ideas, glasnost and perestroika, trying to reform a crumbling system. And this war in Afghanistan? It's a giant, bleeding wound on an already sick economy. It's a political nightmare. Gorbachev looked at the situation and made the call. We're done. Cut our losses. Get out.
So the diplomats get to work, and in April 1988, you have the Geneva Accords. That kicks off the phased withdrawal. And then comes that iconic moment. February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier, General Boris Gromov, walks across the Friendship Bridge back into Soviet territory. After 9 long, brutal years, the occupation was finally over.
But over didn't mean it was without cost. For the Soviet Union, the price was staggering. The official number is 14,453 soldiers killed. But beyond the numbers, you had tens of thousands wounded, and a generation of veterans scarred by a war they couldn't win. It left a deep wound on the national psyche.
But as high as the Soviet cost was, it pales in comparison to what happened to Afghanistan. The numbers are just mind-boggling. Some estimates put the number of Afghan civilians killed as high as 2 million. 2 million people. Millions more became refugees, fleeing to Pakistan and Iran. The country was left in absolute ruins. And here's the most tragic part. The Soviet withdrawal did not bring peace. Not even close. You see, all those foreign countries that had been pouring weapons into the country to fight the Soviets, they pretty much just packed up and left. What you had was a massive power vacuum and a country flooded with weapons. The so-called victorious Mujahideen factions immediately turned their guns on each other. The country collapsed into a horrific civil war. And it was in that chaotic, violent mess that a new, even more radical group emerged, the Taliban. So that brings us to this final, really haunting question. Think about the chain of events. The Soviet invasion creates a power vacuum, which leads to a brutal civil war, which allows the Taliban to rise, which eventually leads to another foreign invasion, this time by the US and its allies. So when we call it a war without winners, did it ever really end? For the people of Afghanistan, who've known decades of non-stop conflict, maybe the tragedy isn't just one war, but a single, unbroken chain of devastation that continues to this very day.